Good day. Today is Thursday, 24th July 2025. Yesterday I discussed the ongoing protests in Kiev and the assault that the Zelensky government has conducted against NABU and SAPOR, the two anti-corruption agencies in Ukraine. And today, in fact, we have seen more protests, though these appear to be on roughly similar scale to the protests that we saw yesterday. The Ukrainian police say around 40,000 people have turned up to the protests in Kiev. I think this is about right. I have a certain experience in measuring crowds. That seems to me about roughly the number of people that are turning up to these protests at the moment. There are other protests in other Ukrainian cities, in Lvov, for example. But to repeat the point I made in my program yesterday, these look to me to be the middle class intelligentsia and people like that in Ukraine, the middle class bourgeoisie, if you prefer, in Ukraine, people who have always been passionately committed to what they believe to be Ukraine's European course. They are the sort of people who produce the writers from Ukraine, who regularly write articles in the Western media. You find their articles appearing every so often in places like The Guardian, Le Monde, American newspapers of various kinds. They have a very strong hostility to Russia, but their major loyalties, if you like, loyalties on behalf of their country, I should make it clear, are towards the West. They have been passionately committed to integrating their country, Ukraine, with the West. And their hostility to Russia is to some extent, at least, a reflection of this. In this, incidentally, I feel that they differ radically from the more hardline people that you tend to find in the nationalist brigades, who, on the contrary, have little time for the West. Their major focus has been hostility to Russia. That has been the driving force for them. They see the relationship with the West in much more manipulative terms, getting Western help to defeat Russia. Whereas, as I said, the kind of people who are protesting in Kiev at the moment want to defeat Russia in order to be able to embrace the West. As I said in my program yesterday, I don't believe that these people have the critical mass or the level of support or the support amongst the various power elements within Ukraine to be able to form an effective challenge to Zelensky's government. What I will say about this, however, is that if I am wrong, which I don't believe I am, but if I am wrong, if these protests do expand beyond the group that is conducting them at the present time, if more sections of Ukrainian society start joining the protests, if they start to expand and involve the various big power brokers in Ukraine, the oligarchs, the nationalist brigades, elements of the security forces, people of that kind, if the dynamic, in other words, changes and Zelensky's government comes under serious threat to the point where he is forced to step down, then it will not stabilize the situation in Ukraine, as many people in the West seem to believe. There is a narrative I have noticed starting to take hold in some sections of the Western media. There was, for example, an article in the Daily Telegraph by Owen Matthews, who wrote that article in The Spectator that I discussed a few days ago. Anyway, Owen Matthews, whilst criticising Zelensky's closure of NABU and SOPA, the two anti-corruption agencies, says that Zelensky has overstayed his time. It's time for him to step down, for Ukraine to have a new leader, somebody who can either negotiate a better peace with the Russians, and Owen Matthews floats the possibility of a new government making concessions to Russia on the rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine, for example. Anyway, Owen Matthews seems to believe that removing Zelensky from the scene will actually in some way stabilize the situation in Ukraine and will enable Ukraine to survive and perhaps even to negotiate some kind of a peace with Russia. I have to say, I take the diametrically opposite view. The first thing to say is that I cannot imagine anybody coming out of the Ukrainian political system from any side of it that would be prepared to make the kind of concessions to Russia which the Russians would accept with a view to ending the war. As we will see shortly in the meeting that has just taken place in Istanbul, the Russians remain implacable. But putting that aside, my own view is that if Zelensky were to fall, what we would see is a return of the immense instability in Ukrainian politics that has in fact beset Ukrainian politics since the period of the Orange Revolution. And in fact, what we would most likely see is intensifying infighting within the Ukrainian political system, an inability to negotiate with the Russians, a fracturing with the nationalist brigades and other elements of that kind within Ukraine, asserting themselves more aggressively and more strongly, and ultimately a much more rapid collapse even than the one that we are seeing now. It's generally recognized, for example, that the coup d'etat that the United States assisted and largely orchestrated in South Vietnam in 1963 against South Vietnam's long-standing leader, President Diem, ultimately undermined the stability of the South Vietnamese regime and accelerated its eventual collapse, which was only delayed for a time by the massive intervention of the United States. I suspect that if Zelensky were to fall in that way, the collapse that we are starting to see take place in Ukraine, the pace of it would accelerate markedly. Anyway, that's my view. Now, I've had a most interesting email from a source, again, somebody who's provided very, very good information about the situation in Ukraine. And this person has told me that there are lots and lots of rumors circulating in Ukraine, and that these rumors have been very widespread for a very long time, that members of Zelensky and his inner circle have been siphoning funds, billions of dollars of funds, from the military aid and financial aid that have been provided by the West, and that this money has been finding its way to foreign bank accounts under the control of all of these people, and that this is what ultimately provoked the decision by Zelensky to close down NABU and SOPA, or to be more precise, to bring them under the direct control of Ukraine's prosecutor general, who is, of course, answerable to Zelensky himself. Now, I want to stress these are rumors, but I've no doubt that these rumors are indeed circulating in Ukraine, and that the reason that it's believed that NABU and SOPA were closed down, again, as part of these rumors, is that Zelensky and his inner circle were worried that Zelensky's political opponents in Ukraine might use Nabu and Sopa to keep track on the money flows and eventually launch a political challenge against him. Now, I want to stress again, these are rumours. I'm not saying that this is proof that those transfers of funds are indeed happening in this way. All I'm saying is, all my sources saying it, is that this is what people in Ukraine are saying. And if you go back to Owen Matthews, he is saying the same thing. He says that there is now a very widespread belief in Ukraine on the part of the Ukrainian population that even as Ukraine bleeds and dies on the battlefronts, the political class in Kiev and its leaders, Ukraine's leaders, are enriching themselves at the expense of the country. And as Owen Matthews correctly says, there is nothing more corrosive to national morale during a time of war than a belief that something like this is indeed happening. Now, I said these are rumours. I am going to express here my own belief, not just my belief, my absolute conviction that these rumours are true. I don't myself have any doubt about this at all. Of course, I can't prove it. I've not got access to bank accounts or money flows. I'm simply basing my beliefs on past experience of what happens in Ukraine. So I believe that this is the case because I think that this is the case. I think that most people in Ukraine are right. And I think that the reason they believe that this is happening is because it is in fact happening. They have enough experience and knowledge of their own society to understand very well what is going on. But this then brings me back to what I discussed in my program yesterday, that as Ukraine now moves steadily towards collapse, and you are starting to see more and more articles in the media in the West that are saying that. Owen Matthews himself spoke about this possibility in that article in The Spectator that I talked about. More importantly and pertinently, we had those two articles in Le Figaro, the one based on advice from a French military officer who spoke about military defeat for Ukraine being inevitable, and a detailed analysis of the conflict by a French historian also interviewed by Le Figaro, in which he said that Ukraine is in a war of attrition, which it is indeed going to lose, and that the course of events is irreversible. Anyway, given that this is so, given that this is clearly obvious to people like Zelensky and his inner circle, it is entirely logical that what these people are trying to do, faced by the coming collapse, is that they want to retain control in Ukraine until the collapse happens, and they want to salt away as much money in the West or in other places outside Ukraine as they can. They don't want to lose power before, because they don't want to be subjected to investigations and all of that by their political enemies inside Ukraine itself. So the game now is to retain control and maximize gain whilst the opportunity to do so is still there. And this is not unusual in crises of this kind. If you go back to the fall of South Vietnam, something very similar happened there, and something also very similar happened in the run-up to the fall of Afghanistan, with all those stories about President Al-Ghani's aircraft private aircraft being filled with suitcases containing banknotes and other things, and there was not enough room or time to move all of the suitcases into the airplane before it had to take off before the Taliban arrived, so that some of those suitcases were supposedly left behind on the runway. Now, again, I want to stress these are reports, these are stories that were circulating. I can't speak to the total truth of them, but I'm pretty sure that even if they weren't fully true, they were mostly true, let me put it that way. So this is not unusual. What is different about Ukraine is that whilst Ukraine has had a deeply corrupt and very predatory political class in control of the country since it gained independence, a political class that has become even more corrupt and even more predatory as the decades have moved on. There has also been within Ukraine a certain section of society which has had a passionate belief in Ukraine. It's been allied with this political class at various times, but it is also in some ways distinct from it. And these are the people you find in the nationalist battalions. And to some extent, it's these people who I suspect, when the end finally comes, are going to be the last people to fight on. Anyway, there it is. So this is what I think is happening in Ukraine at the moment. And as for the people who are protesting, well, they are apparently connected. Now, there's been a lot more information about this provided by various independent media outlets since I last did my program. They've apparently been brought out onto the streets by the various NGOs which are connected to NABU and SOPA, which rely on Western financial aid. And it's that particular class of people, as I said, who are protesting. Now, in terms of the political effects of all of this, the biggest effect is not going to be in Ukraine itself, I predict, but in the West. It is fair to say that over the last 3 weeks, Zelensky has received the worst press in the West that he has done, arguably since he became president back in 2017, but certainly since the conflict began, 2019, but certainly since the conflict began, the current conflict began in February 2022. We've had, over the last 3.5 years, to listen to unending narratives about Zelensky, this heroic Churchillian figure gallantly facing down the Russians, the Russian Goliath, bravely leading Ukraine to its struggle. He's been represented as a sort of peerless hero. I remember after he had his row with Donald Trump and J.D. Vance in the Oval Office back in February, how all of the European leadership, to a man and woman, rallied behind him, the extraordinary statements that they put out on X, which all looked to me like they'd obviously been coordinated with each other. The language was identical. I remember the way in which Zelensky has been literally embraced by people like Keir Starmer on his various trips to London. I remember also how Emmanuel Macron and Ursula von der Leyen and the various members of the German leadership, Annalena Baerbock, now Friedrich Merz, have been his stalwart fans and supporters. Well, for them, all of this, these events in Ukraine, have become extremely difficult to reconcile with this image of Zelensky they have manufactured for themselves. It's very difficult to continue to pretend that he is indeed this heroic, gallant, incorruptible leader when he starts shutting down Western-backed anti-corruption organizations in Ukraine, and when the West's most loyal constituency in Ukraine comes out and protests against him. So one can see the discomfort, and you can see that in all of the various media outlets. You can see this in all these various hit pieces that are now starting to appear in sections of the media criticizing Zelensky. And I suspect here that the damage has now been done. It is going to be very difficult, though perhaps not impossible, to restore the image of Zelensky, to make him once again this heroic, peerless knight who is taking on the dark forces of Moscow on behalf of heroic Ukraine. Having said this, I go back to what I said in my program yesterday. Yes, there have been some criticisms of what Zelensky has done, though not, I notice, to any great extent from the British government. Keir Starmer, for example, has been notably quiet about these developments. But yes, there have been criticisms. Ursula von der Leyen has expressed her concern. Various senators in the United States, including, of course, Lindsey Graham, have now come out and said that they're very concerned about the fact that Ukraine might be backtracking on its up to now supposedly successful work in contesting corruption. I don't know why Lindsey Graham believes that Ukraine has been successful in contesting corruption. I have seen no evidence of that. On the contrary, my own sense is that over the last 5 years, and certainly since the Maidan events of 2014, corruption in Ukraine has actually got worse. But anyway, we're each entitled, I suppose, to our views. Anyway, Lindsey Graham and some senators have issued a stern statement. I don't think Zelensky is going to pay any attention to this. I don't think any of his backers are going to pay any attention to this, because in practical terms, there is no sign that the West is going to do anything different. They're not going to stop or reduce the money flows to Ukraine. They're still trying to find arms to send to Ukraine. They continue to provide Ukraine, which for these purposes means Zelensky, with the political backing that he needs. And as I said, I think that Zelensky will just ignore these latest statements. He's made comments. He made some comments yesterday about the fact that in 2 weeks' time, the Parliament, the Rada, might be reconvened to pass a new law to regulate Nabu and Sopa. This is clearly, as far as I can see, intended to cause some of these people who are protesting to back off, and maybe Western governments as well. But the point is that if the Ukrainian parliament passes legislation in a kind of a way, that will also confirm that the Ukrainian government now is in control of Nabu and Sopar. So I don't see that this is a substantive concession in any way at all. So anyway, there it is. This is what I believe. I think that Zelensky will get through this immediate crisis. He'll have got rid of Nabu and Sopar. He'll have upset many people in the United States. He will have offended the people in the embassy. I don't think, however, that Donald Trump and J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio and the people in Washington overall care very much about this. In the case of Donald Trump, as I discussed in my program yesterday, I don't believe that he has any great liking for Nabu and Sopar, which were, by the way, set up, in part at least, at the instigation of former President Biden at a time when Biden was Barack Obama's vice president and point man in Ukraine. So I don't myself believe that Trump is going to lose any sleep over the abolition or the curtailing of Nabu and Sopar. And if the United States, if the administration doesn't act, realistically nothing further is going to happen. So this is my view. The most important point, however, is that Zelensky is tightening control. And the reason he is tightening control is because he and the people around him can see the writing on the wall. They are aware that events are moving forward rapidly towards an inevitable outcome, and they're making preparations for it. Now, that now brings me to the topic of the negotiations, because yesterday we had a third round of negotiations in Istanbul. And as I've said already, there's some mystery as to why these negotiations took place at all. The Russians, back in June, proposed a third round for the negotiations in Istanbul to take place on the 22nd of June. The Ukrainians did not respond. Zelensky, in fact, made various public comments appearing to reject the idea of further negotiations in Istanbul. But he didn't appear to be rejecting further negotiations in Istanbul. He spoke out clearly against it. He said that the negotiations in Istanbul were leading nowhere and there was no point in them. And he then, as I've discussed, sought to sack his chief negotiator, Rustem Umarov, by also sacking him to his post as defense minister and packing him off to Washington, D.C. as ambassador. And then something changed, and suddenly, out of the blue and unexpectedly, the Russians were taken by surprise by it. Zelensky announced that the moment had come to resume the negotiations in Istanbul. Umerov, reappointed to Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, would again be leading the Ukrainian negotiating team. Zelensky then announced that the delegation would be going to Istanbul on the 23rd of July, and the Russians, who'd been barely informed of anything of this in advance, scrambled to get their team together and sent it to Istanbul to meet with the Ukrainians there. Now, in recent programs, I've suggested that the meeting in Istanbul almost certainly happened at the insistence of the Trump administration, and that remains my continuing view. There is another view which has been expressed and which might also be true, which is that Zelensky might be taking hope from Donald Trump's announcement 10 days ago that if the Russians didn't agree a deal with Ukraine within 50 days, then the Trump administration would impose 100% tariffs on Russia and 100% tariffs on any country buying energy products from Russia. And I've seen it speculated that Zelensky might have thought that faced by a threat of that kind, the Russians, if they did meet with the Ukrainians, might finally start to make concessions. Well, if that was Zelensky's belief, the meeting yesterday in Istanbul would have disabused him, because it is absolutely clear that the Russians didn't give an inch. The entire meeting appears to have been dominated to a greater extent even than the previous two meetings by the Russian chief negotiator, Vladimir Medinsky, who, by the way, has come into his own and has found his voice. And in contrast to his conduct in February and March 2022, is now an extremely incisive and forceful commentator about the negotiations, and appears to be giving not an inch in the discussions. So, on the topic of the sanctions and the tariffs, Medinsky told the Ukrainians that these threats of tariffs and sanctions didn't impress the Russians at all. It wouldn't make them budge an inch from their position. And in fact, he rather pointedly reminded the Ukrainians that after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, after the Russian Civil War of 1918 to 21, the Soviet Union was in effect placed under a virtual economic blockade. In fact, not a virtual economic blockade, essentially a total economic blockade. Trade between the Soviet Union and the West shrank to minimal levels. There was very little diplomatic contact, certainly in the 1920s. There was a certain easing in the 1930s, but hardly to any very great extent. And yet, during that period, the Soviet economy expanded significantly. And when eventually war came in 1941, the Soviets prevailed against Germany in the Titanic War that followed. Well, Medinsky is overstating things. There was actually a significant amount of trade between the Soviets and the West in the 1930s. The Soviets did import quite a lot of technology and industrial goods from the United States, especially in the 1930s. But anyway, he is making a strong point. Russia has never shown itself susceptible to sanctions pressure. There's no reason to think that it will. There's been a consistent trend ever since 2014 in the West to overestimate the West's ability to influence Russian policy by exerting sanctions pressure. And besides, not only will the sanctions fail as an instrument of pressure on the Russians, which, as several people, by the way, on my threads have correctly pointed out, Russia is, after all, a country which is food and energy self-sufficient, which makes it mostly impervious, invulnerable to sanctions pressure. But not only that, but the key point is that it's all but inconceivable that Russia's main trading partners, China, India, other countries, will in fact submit to Donald Trump's dictates and end trade relations with Russia if there is no deal done within the next 40 or so days. So Medinsky, anyway, made that point absolutely clear. He apparently reiterated all the points that the Russians have made previously in previous negotiations. He essentially rejected the settlement freeze idea, which was Ukraine's proposal, both in the second and third round of the talks. He also rejected the Ukrainian proposal for an early summit meeting between Putin and Zelensky. He said that before such a meeting can take place, there needs to be at least the outlines of an agreement between the two presidents that they can work with and move forward with, so that a meeting between them can be productive. So Medinsky gave no ground. He did suggest further humanitarian exchanges of prisoners, exchanges of dead between Ukraine and Russia. He said that the Russians were working to go through the list of the various children that Ukraine claims are in Russia. He again was fairly dismissive of Ukrainian claims here. He said many of the children that the Ukrainians are complaining about are not in Russia and have never in fact been in Russia. Anyway, that's what he said. And overall, as I said, he gave no ground at all. He did make one proposal, which is that the delegations, the Russian and Ukrainian delegations, form three working parties to discuss various specific topics, such as military affairs, humanitarian affairs, that sort of thing. Now, if this was a genuine negotiation, if there was an infinite amount of time to move forward, then the working party idea would be a good one. It would indeed move us forward into a position where negotiations between Russia and Ukraine might start to make progress. It's often the case when two parties come to negotiate over an intractable conflict, that if they break things down and if they have specialist groups looking at particular problems, then over time, by isolating the problems, you can start to make progress and put the pieces together. As I said, it's a conventional negotiating strategy. But of course, there isn't, in terms of the conflict in Ukraine, an infinite amount of time. On the contrary, things on the battlefronts, as we're going to discuss in a moment, are continuing to move very rapidly. And besides, I remain of the view that Ukraine is not prepared to make the fundamental compromises to meet the Russian demands. That is the only way in which this negotiation can hope to move forward. So anyway, if Zelensky's expectation or hope was that the Russians would show what he would call flexibility or weakness simply because of Donald Trump's threats of 10 days ago, well, Zelensky will now have found the opposite. The Russians remain as firm as ever. Will there be a fourth round? Well, who knows? I'm going to make a guess that Zelensky is going to be very disappointed by the outcome of these talks, whatever happens. He's never been keen on negotiations. He'll be very frustrated that he's not getting the one-to-one meeting with Putin that he's been agitating for months now, indeed years in fact. And I'm not convinced that he will want to go to a fourth round myself. The Ukrainians did not agree to Medinsky's proposal for working parties to be set up. This is going to be referred to Zelensky. We'll see what Zelensky decides. But for the moment, it seems to me these talks are deadlocked. And I can't really imagine that that's going to change anytime soon. So, What remains? Well, the war. The war goes on, and here there has been further news. So there were more Russian missile attacks, missile and drone attacks last night. The Russians struck Odessa, place where, of course, a lot of the supplies from the West are channeled through. There's not been much information as to what exactly it was that the Russians attacked in Odessa. The Ukrainians launched drone attacks on the massive, sprawling Russian Black Sea resort of Sochi, at the eastern end of the Black Sea. Now, Sochi is a huge place. It's, in some ways, I mean, it fulfills something like the same kind of role for Russia that, say, Miami does for the United States. Just saying. It's a huge place. It is, of course, the height of the tourist season. We're in July, late July, second part of July. So there would have been a lot of holiday makers, Russian holiday makers, in Sochi. Sending drones against Sochi would have been, well, something that would have alarmed a lot of people, spoilt their holidays, alarmed a lot of holiday makers. Apparently 2 people, civilians, were killed during this drone attack. It is not at all clear what exactly it was that the Ukrainians were targeting. I'm going to make one further observation about Sochi. It is in the area of Sochi that Putin's big summer residence, to be more precise, presidential residence, is located. This is where Putin sometimes, well, mostly goes in the summer. When I say it's a presidential residence, it's an enormous complex. He often receives visitors, foreign visitors there. Whole conferences can take place in this complex. Perhaps, just possibly, whoever was responsible for those drone attacks on Sochi thought that they were conveying a message to Putin. We can reach you if you go to Sochi. We can send our drones there. You're not safe wherever you are. Presumably negotiate with us, because if you don't, well, we might come for you. There have been, I have to say, a number of comments from Ukrainian leaders recently which do appear to make direct threats of that kind against members of the Russian leadership, including Putin himself, and the Ukrainian intelligence chief, Kirill Budanov, has publicly admitted that the Ukrainians have already made several attempts to assassinate Putin, which up to now have been unsuccessful. Well, all I will say about that is this: if Putin does come to Sochi this summer, he will be well protected. I would have thought that it would be very difficult indeed for Ukrainian drones to reach him. But that doesn't exclude the possibility that this was indeed intended as a message. The point is, if we look at this in pure military terms, again, the Ukrainian drone attack on Sochi did no essential damage to the Russians, whilst what little we know about the Russian missile and drone attack on Odessa suggests that it did much damage indeed. Now, on the battlefronts, we continue to receive news. And it seems that over the last couple of hours, for example, the Russians have begun their assault on a village called Kolodizy, not far from the town of Liman, which is located to the east of the city of Slavyansk, which is the northern city in the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka conurbation. There are reports, incidentally, that the Ukrainian authorities are now calling on the remaining inhabitants in in Kramatorsk, a city normally with a population of around 300,000, if my memory serves me rightly, but I might be overstating it. Anyway, it's apparently fallen from whatever its original level to around 50,000. Anyway, they're calling on the remaining residents of Kramatorsk to leave, pointing out that the Russians at various places are within 12 kilometers of Kramatorsk. So, anyway, fighting close to Liman, threats potentially towards Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. The main battle continues to be in south of Konstantinovka, where the Russians have apparently now occupied perhaps the entirety of the village of Sherbinovka, which is located to the west of Sherbinovka, which is located to the west of Toretsk. The fall of Sherbinovka and the Russian capture of Yablunovka and Alexandro Kalinova apparently, definitely opens the way for the Russians to move northwards towards the villages of Katerinovka and Klebanbek, effectively closing the lid on the cauldron of the Ukrainian troops who are still located in this area south of Konstantinovka and the Klebanbek reservoir. It is extraordinary to me that the Ukrainians continue to defend this position. But anyway, there it is. And as I've said already, the Russians have been advancing in other places. They already controlled the village of Plesheyevka, which is located to the north of Klebanbek. They've recently captured the village of Belagora, which is located a little to the east, the northeast of Plesheyevka. One can steadily see now a Russian advance closer and closer, edging closer all the time towards Konstantinovka, which is not yet perhaps fully under siege, but which soon will be. However, the more dramatic news is coming from Pokrovsk. I say dramatic, but there are reports, but some of these reports are rather difficult to confirm, and one cannot be absolutely certain that they are true. But anyway, firstly, it seems that the Russians are now indeed clearing more villages to the northeast of Pokrovsk. So places like Fyodorivka, Zatishok, places still further north of those places, Poltavka, Shahove, they're all apparently in the process of being captured by the Russian army. The Russians, according to some reports, are still there on the outskirts of Rodinska, which continues to be bombed and shelled. The road into Pokrovsk through Rodinska is in effect closed. There's been film now showing fighting going on inside Novoekonomichny. It's clear that there are still Ukrainian troops in Novoekonomichny, but the fighting appears to be very intense. The Russians are shelling and attacking with drones Ukrainian positions right across this village, this big village. It doesn't seem to me as if the Ukrainians are going to be able to hold out there. And the fact that the Russians are now publishing film of ongoing fighting in Novoekonomichny strongly suggests to me that this village is indeed about to fall under full, complete Russian control. Anyway, I should add, by the way, that the Russian Air Force in this area also apparently is extremely active, and that there is a lot of bombing with fab bombs of Ukrainian positions. So all of this is very dramatic, and it's obviously a crisis. But to say it also, it's perhaps not the place where the most dramatic things are taking place. Now, here, the next part of what I'm going to say depends entirely on whether you believe the various reports that are circulating. But the reports say that the Russians are indeed established now in southwest Pokrovsk, that they control villages like Zvirova, Leontonivka, and Shakhtarsky in southwest Pokrovsk, that they have established positions along various roads, main roads, inside Pokrovsk, and that they are approaching the junction of the E50 highway that leads to Pokrovsk from the west, from Dnipro, the E50 highway being the main highway that the Ukrainians still use to send their supplies to the garrison inside the town. Now, to be clear, this is happening inside the metropolitan boundary of Pokrovsk itself. Now, if this is true, if it is indeed the case that the Russians are close to the junctions, the road junctions, connecting the various roads to the E50 highway, and that they are about to cut the E50 highway itself, establish physical control of the E50 highway at the point where it enters Pokrovsk, then all of the supply roads, the main supply roads into Pokrovsk, are cut. And the garrison in Pokrovsk, which amounts to several brigades, the Ukrainian garrison in Pokrovsk, is not just surrounded, but is in a cauldron. It is, in fact, in a critical situation. The Russians would be located on every section around Pokrovsk, except an area to the northwest of Pokrovsk, where in theory the Ukrainians could still evacuate, if they have access to this area, across small roads, including a road that passes through a village called Grishinye. I believe this is an asphalted road, but apparently it's quite narrow, quite small, a light road, and dirt roads across open fields. Now, if this is all true, and if the Ukrainians can no longer receive supplies along the E50, or won't be able to receive supplies along the E50 road, then, as I said, the Ukrainian garrison in Pokrovsk is in an operational crisis. And I would say that in that case, we could be looking at a collapse in Pokrovsk within a matter of weeks, conceivably, if the road is indeed cut, even days. Now, it bears repeating at this point that there is no film at the moment, there is no independent corroboration that the Russians are indeed advancing through western Pokrovsk in this way, and that they have indeed reached the junction or are close to reaching the junction of the E50 highway. But these are the reports that are circulating. They have been reported by Redovka, the Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, and stated there as a fact. It may be that the situation is less critical for the Ukrainians than that, and that these reports are, as is said sometimes, premature. But there must be a possibility, based on what we already know, that the situation, that these reports are true, in which case, as I said, we could see a collapse in Pokrovsk quickly. Now, we're talking about several brigades in Pokrovsk. It's not like Ugleda, when basically there was one brigade that was defending Ugleda, or Mariupol, where we were talking about two brigades. If there is an encirclement of, I think it's at least three brigades, even if these are critically under strength inside Pokrovsk, then we're looking at a massive crisis on a scale that Ukraine has not experienced up to now, and we would have a situation also where, with the loss of Pokrovsk, as I've discussed already, the Russians are in a strong position to start outflanking Ukrainian positions in Kramatorsk and Slavyansk and Konstantinovka as well, outflanking them from the west. And that may explain why the Ukrainian authorities are now calling on the civilian population, the remaining civilian population in Kramatorsk, to evacuate immediately. So, we'll just have to wait and see. As I said, it's possible that things are indeed as critical as this. If they are, then this is an event as dramatic in its way as the infiltration into Avdiivka by the Russian First Special Forces unit through a pipe, an infiltration that caused the collapse of the Ukrainian defenses in Avdiivka in the winter of 2024, and the infiltration of the Russian forces into Sudzha, in Kursk region, also through a pipe which created a collapse of the Ukrainian defenses in Sudzha in March of this year. So let's see. Let's see whether these reports are true. If this happens, it will be the biggest defeat Ukraine has suffered in the war up to now. It will exceed, in consequence, the defeats in Mariupol and in Sudzha and even in Avdiivka. Perhaps the only defeat that would be as consequential would have been the defeat of Ukraine's summer offensive in 2023. Anyway, let's wait and see. We are, as I said, perhaps entering the crisis moment in the Battle of Pokrovsk. If so, then it is happening at a speed which is astonishing, much faster than I think anybody anticipated. And maybe, just maybe, the various things that have been happening in Kiev, the attack on Nabu and Sopa, the moves to try to restart the negotiations with the Russians in Istanbul, are associated with all of this and with the panic that is thereby being generated. Now, yesterday in my program, I discussed the various steps which have been taken in the West to try to rescue Ukraine, to send forces to help Ukraine through these battles. The American plan, accepted by the Europeans, whereby the Americans sell their weapons to NATO, and NATO then transfers them to Ukraine so that the Americans get money and the Ukrainians get weapons. Well, I should say that we're getting reports that the United States is actually making another direct transfer of weapons to Ukraine. There is some uncertainty as to its exact value. I've seen reports that its value is $175 million and that it is mostly connected to the supply of Hawk anti-aircraft missiles. There are others that put the figure higher, $310 or $20 million, and as well as the Hawk anti-aircraft missiles, Bradley infantry fighting vehicles will also be supplied. There was a report in the German media recently that Ukraine had only 120 Bradleys left, which is insufficient for a front line that is over 1,000 kilometers long. And Zelensky himself, as I discussed in my program yesterday, has admitted that Ukraine is running desperately short of armor and needs more armor from the West. Well, we'll have to see. I would say that I think this is probably true. I'm not sure whether this delivery is being made by Trump exercising his drawdown authority. In other words, using money left over from the $61 billion appropriation that Congress voted in April 2024. Just saying. Or maybe we're still seeing the pipeline of weapons previously authorized by Biden continue. I simply don't know. I would say that there's logic in terms of both of these deliveries. The Bradleys, as I said, are definitely needed. They are perhaps the only armored vehicle that the West has supplied to Ukraine that has proved reasonably effective in Ukrainian conditions. The Russians have made criticisms of it. They say it is too big and too heavy, that it's difficult to repair, that it is underarmed, but overall they do nonetheless consider it to be an effective and mechanically reliable and well protected vehicle. They are much more complimentary about the Bradley than they are about any of the tanks or other armoured vehicles that Ukraine has been provided with. The Hawks are an anti-aircraft missile system developed by the United States in the 1950s. Obviously, what we're talking about is significantly updated versions of these missiles. It's been suggested that they do have a utility for Ukraine, not so much in shooting down Russian missiles or Russian fighter jets, which these Hawk missiles are no longer really able to threaten or to challenge effectively, but that these missiles can shoot down Russian drones, the Geran drones. All I would say about that is that this is no doubt true, but if you look at the size and complexity of a Hawk missile and the associated system, the radar and all of that, you are talking about what is still, even if it does use old technology in many of its features, you're still talking about a large, bulky, complex, sophisticated, heavy system, and you are deploying it against light drones that the Russians are now mass producing in enormous quantities. It still seems to me like a massive disproportion in weapons. What Ukraine needs in order to counter these vast drone swarms that Russia is now deploying against Ukraine are systems that can be developed in similar quantities and at similar cost to counter the drone swarms. Now, no less a person than the former Ukrainian military chief, General Zelensky, has actually been talking about this, and he has said that Ukraine is at a dead end because the Russians have moved further ahead in the relevant technologies than Ukraine has done. He's said this in a radio interview, actually not radio interview, on a YouTube channel, the Left Bank YouTube channel. He said that we should not focus on why the dead end emerged. There is a fact that it exists. Our enemy, the Russians, found a way out. Whilst we were looking for more drones to stabilize the situation and make defense sustainable, they went the other way. They excellently exited the situation. They expanded the combat zone and invented fiber optic drones. Fiber optic drones fully disrupt our logistics and cut the ways to deliver ammunition. We stopped after we created mobile air defense groups. Russia responded by simply increasing the drone altitude to 2,000 meters. We failed for objective and subjective reasons to quickly master the new capabilities. I mean all technologies, not just drones. And then Zelensky went on to say that the only way out for Ukraine out of this dead end is for it to exploit technologies at least as effectively as the Russians have done. Those who call for another 1 million soldiers to be added to the Ukrainian army are wrong. By the way, that is impossible. We do not need people, we need brains to build up the strategy. The number of killed and wounded Ukrainians is already critical for the demographic situation in Ukraine. Yes, Zelensky actually said that. Now, of course, Zelensky is right. I've already made this point previously. The claim that one sees circulating still in the West, that the Ukrainians are still ahead of the Russians in the drone war, bears no relation to the actual reality on the battlefronts. Probably, drone for drone, the handmade individual Ukrainian drones using Western components are superior to the Russian ones using mass-produced Russian components and allegedly imported Chinese ones, though both sides use imported Chinese technology for their drones, just to say. But, as I've discussed in several programs now, the Russians, because they do things industrially, in big factories, are able to produce drones in quantities that the Ukrainians cannot match, and they are able to spread technologies throughout their drone fleets much faster and more completely than the Ukrainians with their fragmented artisanal drone industry can do. And what Zelensky perhaps doesn't acknowledge is that there is no answer for the Ukrainians for this problem. Certainly rolling out old Hawk missiles, some of which, well, whose design origins go back to the 1960s, and which were then updated in the 1980s, but which, as I said, are big, complex pieces of equipment. That's not going to solve Ukraine's problem any more than the very big, very heavy, very elaborate Oerlikon Skynex guns, cannons, and associated radar systems provided by Germany can do. So that is the reality. And as I said, I don't think Ukraine has the technological or industrial landscape structure to be able to reproduce the Russian drone or artillery or other systems in scale. And of course, it's not just drones of which Ukraine is now running short. It's running short of infantry, as I've discussed in many programs now. In fact, as many people have been discussing, and it's running out of armored vehicles, which will be ameliorated to some extent when the Bradleys appear, though that could take several weeks. And it is critically short of shells and artillery. And I doubt now that there is anything that can be done about this. The West has scrounged through its artillery stockpiles, its shell stockpiles. It's brought in shells from South Korea, from Pakistan, from all sorts of places. President Pavel came up with his disastrous scheme to buy shells on the international arms market. And none of that in the end has done any good. We've now probably reached the end point there, now that the infusion of shells from the Syrian front line, from the Syrian army supplied by Turkey, now that that infusion of shells has also run out. Russia has no shortage of shells. They continue to produce them in huge quantities, millions of shells a year, and allegedly they are also now importing shells in huge numbers from North Korea, where they are being built in North Korean factories with Russian know-how and supervision as well. Now, that now brings us back to the other deliveries, this whole complicated story of arms deliveries to Ukraine from the West. Yesterday, I said that Boris Pistorius had said that Germany would be providing Ukraine with 5 Patriot missile systems, and that Germany was now at the head of the queue because Switzerland had dropped out, and that Germany, however, would eventually, or rather Switzerland would get its replacement Patriot missile systems from the United States, because as it's in the head of the queue for Patriot missile systems, ahead of Switzerland. Well, that was what Boris Pistorius said, and I took him at his word in my program yesterday. Perhaps I shouldn't have done, because Der Spiegel, German magazine, is now saying that the first German Patriot system is unlikely to reach Ukraine for a further 8 months. The reason is that there are still issues about supply of Patriot missiles from the United States itself to replace the ones that Germany is sending to Ukraine. So the Germans want guarantees for American deliveries. The Americans are short of Patriot missiles. They cannot increase production rates. So it's unlikely that Ukraine is going to see Patriot missiles for 8 months. In other words, the rest of the summer, the autumn, the first part of the winter, all of that is going to pass before the Patriot missiles are going to appear. By that time, Pokrovsk will have fallen. For all I know, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk will have fallen too. And then where will Ukraine be? Just saying. And in terms of other weapon systems, I still get the impression, I increasingly get the impression, that transfers of weapons from the West are drying up. Money is still being sent to Ukraine by the West. Shmyhal is probably likely to get the $60 billion that he is asking for. But weapons are in short supply and cannot be sent in quantity anymore. In fact, it's incredible, given the realities, that there's even talk of sending them at all. So, again, maybe in a rational universe, this is what Zelensky and his officials would be saying to themselves, what the Europeans would be saying to themselves. We can't go on supplying Ukraine with weapons. Weapons from the West have failed to turn the tide. The Russian tide continues to rise. Perhaps the moment has come to make peace. To repeat again, I see no sign of this. Instead, what I continue to see is continued denial. There's a truly extraordinary article which I've seen appear in the Daily Telegraph by Matthew Lynn, who is one of the Daily Telegraph's writers on economic policy, and he writes about the economic situation in Britain. I've mentioned that Britain continues to experience ongoing deindustrialization, and of course Germany is deindustrializing as well, and it's obvious to me that the severance of economic links with Russia is one of the major causes. But in this long article about deindustrialization in Britain, about the collapse, the ongoing collapse of the British motor car industry, Matthew Lynn never mentions the economic war with Russia. Just consider these two paragraphs in that article. Our sky-high energy prices have made almost any form of manufacturing punishingly expensive. Industrial electricity costs around 50% more in Britain than in France, and almost 4 times as much as in the United States and Canada, according to data from the Office for National Statistics. Whole swathes of the oil and chemicals industries have already closed down, and now the auto manufacturers are going the same way. Energy is one of the main costs of any factory, and when it costs far more than in other countries, it is impossible to compete. Well, all of that is true, but why not explain why the energy costs relative to that in other countries, in Britain, and by the way in Europe, has skyrocketed in the way that it has? It's perfectly obvious, because Britain and the Europeans are no longer buying oil and gas from Russia. That is the proximate explanation. There are other longer-term causes, no doubt. The decision to invest, or perhaps overinvest, in green technologies, which I know some people get very exercised about. No doubt also there have been some bad decisions, the fragmentation of the energy industry in Britain, all sorts of things. But the main proximate reason why energy costs in Britain has skyrocketed over the last 3 years is because of the economic war that the Europeans and the British continue to wage against Russia. And they are continuing to do it. They have just taken further decisions to stop all further imports of oil and gas from Russia after 2027. So Europe now buys enormous amounts of LNG from Russia, but that is supposed to end in 2027. Something it is inevitably going to have a knock-on effect on Britain as well, even if it doesn't buy LNG directly from Russia. Diesel and other oil from Russia, that also can no longer be accessed, despite the fact that Russia is the biggest producer and supplier of oil in close proximity to Europe. And then we see our factories closed down, the oil and chemical industries in Germany and in Britain, the manufacturing industry, heavy machinery, engineering, all of these, they're all closing down because of the sky-high energy costs. But we won't explain why. We won't tell ourselves why. We tell ourselves all the time that by cutting off Russia's exports of oil and gas, we are going to cut the financing for Putin's war machine. There's no evidence that this has happened up to now. There is plenty of evidence that our industrial base is disappearing. But we go on doing it. We just go on doing it year after year, and there is no pushback against it until people like Matthew Lynn start to conduct a frank discussion about this. I cannot see why things can possibly begin to get better. Now, this is where I'm going to finish my discussion of the conflict in Ukraine. There is one last topic I want to talk about. It's a very distressing one. Yesterday, I was looking at the media in Britain, and I was looking at some absolutely appalling pictures coming out of Gaza. The situation in Gaza has been getting worse by the day. There is now talk of famine. I think it's more than just talk. I think that there is a reality of famine conditions in Gaza. There is, again, a complete suppression of discussion of this topic. I have difficulties talking about other topics, but this one in Britain, at least, is particularly difficult to talk about, and I've discussed in many places the sensitivities to this platform. Well, all I can say is this is the most monstrous thing I can imagine and have seen happen at any time in my adult lifetime. No doubt there have been worse crimes committed in other places, in Cambodia in the 1970s, for example. But I've never seen pictures quite like this, because perhaps there wasn't the access there that there is here. And of course, all of this is happening close to Europe and is happening in a place where Israel is an advanced technological industrial country. Just saying. Now, it's not as if this topic is not being discussed in Israel itself. I go to the Israeli media. I read Haaretz, for example. They're much more forthright and open in discussion about this whole issue than it is permissible to be in Britain and in parts of Europe today. Now, Steve Witkoff, who has been absent from view for several weeks now, has suddenly resurfaced. He is negotiating, apparently via Qatar, to try to get some kind of ceasefire agreed in Gaza. The moral imperative to do that is obviously huge. The humanitarian imperative is huge. The political one is also. Because when things like this are done, as night follows day, political consequences follow. And they will be as huge as the event itself. Anybody who is in any doubt about this does not know history and does not understand history. There will be a reckoning. And, well, let's hope that there is that ceasefire soon. Though, inevitably, given what has already happened, the reckoning will come. Anyway, that is all I'm afraid I can say. I'm troubled by the fact that I cannot say more. But that is what I am going to say today. And this is where I'm going to finish the video. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our platforms, our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. If you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.